So with the release of a sick new Season 3 teaser trailer, we also got some insight into what the seasonal mechanics and themes are going to be. So in this video here, I basically want to cover probably the most important part, which is an adorable little robot buddy that we got that runs around with us, kills demons for us, and probably implements some of the more interesting side parallel buff systems that we've seen in the game to date. And obviously, like any good content creator would do, I went and made tier lists so that you could at least get my initial feelings on how these different skills and abilities are going to play into the builds and what potential they have. I'm also going to try to let you all in on some weird tech that I think is going to be enabled by the addition of these cool little battle robot pets of ours, and something that people may not initially be thinking of, but I think might very quickly melt into the overall meta as a really awesome tool for us. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let's go ahead and just break down what I'm talking about and what you need to understand so that the tier lists and the mechanics I'm going to break down actually make sense. We are going to be gaining the Seneschal companion. It's this cool little skittery robot that just looks a lot like Dwemer artifacts from Morrowind. In fact, this overall picture in general just screams the Elder Scrolls Morrowind to me. I don't know if that's just you, but it's kind of like way too on the nose. I love it. Don't get it wrong. I absolutely love it. But the art style and all of that is just like very reminiscent of this. But basically we have a little arcanic pet, and we're going to be able to outfit that mechanic pet with two different abilities that can then be further modified. So similar to how Path of Exile used modifications on skills inside of the sockets in your gear, and Torchlight Infinite has as a modification system for its skills, we're basically going to be able to do the exact same thing for this little pet of ours. The long and short is that we are going to have two governing stones. You'll be able to put a governing stone here and a governing stone here. And that's basically going to decide the two things that your pet does, whether or not it attacks from melee or ranged, uses scorching lightning bolts, or throws up a protective barrier around you. You're effectively going to be able to choose two effects that it does on a cooldown that you're then able to modify with the tuning stones. So if we put a governing stone here and a governing stone here, we will then put a tuning stone in these three slots, which will modify how this skill works, and then three on this side that'll modify how this skill works. Playing through the season's journey, as well as playing through all of the new content with the vaults and then a pseudo new Legion type event, which we don't have all of the actual like specifics on yet, but sounds a lot like a Legion event to me. You'll be able to go out and farm these different stones. You'll also be able to level up these stones. So it's not only just going and unlocking all of them, but it's also leveling them up as you go further. You'll be able to craft them, you merge them together, they get stronger and stronger. So very similar to the vampire abilities, some of them were locked behind the season's journey, some of them you just kind of unlock by playing the game itself. Then you're going to get some type of material which is used to then empower them further until they get to their highest level. So while there are going to be 12 governing stones, or 12 different abilities that your pet can do, there are 27 tuning stones. These are going to modify those skills in some impactful way. And the interesting part is that two of the stones, because here's all the ones, they're all listed out, but two of the stones were not listed. So they're adding a little bit of mystery here, like, oh, we're going to have to go unlock them and figure them out. I assume the data mine will have these picked out immediately, but there's nothing we can really do about that. The interesting part, though, is that while there are two stones missing, and we know that there will be 12 governing and 27 tuning, there are actually only 11 governing listed here, and only 25 tuning listing here. So that does mean that we're missing one stone that theoretically should already have been revealed to us, or this number here is just wrong in some way. Like I said, I created a tier list both for the actual skills themselves and then for the modifiers of those skills. So I basically like to go through them, explain what I think the general skill will be doing, how I think it will be impactful, and then explain how these different modifiers, which I think are the real meat and potatoes of this overall implementation, how it's going to affect the players themselves, is really going to play out and how strong they're going to be as well. Obviously, this is pure speculation, but what else do you watch content like this to do other than to speculate, right? It's fun to think about it until we get more specifics on Thursday about how all of this kind of works together. But I figured we have a decent amount of information here, at least enough to take a wild swing at it. And I also just wanted to very quickly explain my thought process in approaching trying to tier these out, because obviously it's going to be pretty hard, right? Like, we haven't seen the little robots in battle. We don't exactly know how they're going to work. But the developers have been quoted saying that basically seasonal content and seasonal power that comes along with it is supposed to be fairly even. Obviously season 1 was kind of bananas with the Barber Heart, but season 2 really had a return to form of functional, interesting bonuses and quality of life changes that it brought to builds. And I would argue that the vampiric powers basically doubled our damage output. If you take all the different multipliers you could get, the different amount of utility from metamorphosis, more permanent uptime on vulnerability, etc., I'd say roughly we had basically like 100% damage multiplier. So I'm assuming that these robots are going to be equivalent to that. So they're either going to add a huge amount of quality of life, or they're going to do a decent amount of damage themselves that would be equal to having 100% damage multiplier on your kit as well. So they're going to represent a decent amount of our damage, but not overshadow us in some way. And I don't think that they're just going to single-handedly rip through content. So with all of that being said, let's go ahead and start at the bottom of the tier list for governing stones. So skills this robot's going to use that I think are just like absolutely trash or are too niche, or until we see something else, probably not worth your time. So the first ability here is Impale. Impale is going to do a melee ranged line attack to all enemies in front of it. I'm thinking it's basically just going to like shoot a little melee ranged bolt through everything that's in front of it. And if monsters are somehow in a perfect line, it'll apply damage to all of them. As far as the melee attacks that are available on the list, I don't think that this one brings enough to the table or is going to be representative of enough DPS for it to like significantly alter your boss kill speed. And it sounds just like too specific and too niche to me to really warrant use. Now, there might be a world where this Impale shoots out to like the entirety of the screen, and I'm completely wrong here. There's a world where this thing sees some use, but it definitely seems like the worst option as far as melee range skills that the bot currently has. Auto defense is a little hard to wrap my head around, but here's what I think it's going to do. The bot periodically is going to lay down an area of effect field that stops projectiles. It doesn't work on boss projectiles, and it doesn't work on player projectiles, but where it is, it will create this field. So it's like a bubble that you could go run into so that you don't have to be afraid of enemy projectiles. And that seems pretty cool, except based off the verbiage and how it seems like it's going to work. It looks like it's going to cast it on top of itself. And there's a modifier that says that the robot will now be able to teleport every once in a while. So I really feel like this bot's going to be caught lagging behind us and randomly spawning an anti-projectile field like 10 feet back in the dungeon just doesn't seem incredibly relevant. Now, there's one thing that this hinges on, and it's whether or not the mechanics in the vaults, something that I'll cover in another video. But basically what you need to know is that we're basically going to be doing vault runs where how good we are at dodging damage is going to determine how good the rewards are at the end. So rewarding player like play ability as opposed to just like DPS or tankiness. And there's a world where this field is required to be able to stop the traps in it from being able to deal its damage via projectiles. And there's also a boss at the end that theoretically is going to summon a bunch of traps. If all of that is true, there is a universe where this field is just like required to be able to survive with the max number of bonuses at the end to get the most loot possible. Outside of that, though, I can't imagine randomly spawning an anti-projectile like field somewhere in the battle without us being able to control when it happens or where it happens. Just isn't going to be impactful. Is this going to protect me from a corpse bow just off screen one-shotting me? Maybe. If this thing can teleport to me and targets me with its ability and then puts down the field all while the bow is literally aiming its attack, maybe it has some utility there. For C tier, we're going to see things that like are going to have a niche use, may have some value, may only be particular to like one or two off meta builds, or only interact with very certain systems that the majority of players can't really like benefit from. So here we have Reconstruct. It's going to channel a beam of healing into us based off of a maximum amount of life over time. One of my major issues with this is that as this bot is channeling, that means it's not doing other things. So if you really needed it to be doing like outputting DPS, but you're hoping to use it for survivability, it's kind of at odds with itself. And then on top of that, while this will seemingly work with Temerity be able to generate barrier, since Temerity just says healing effects on you that overheal, generate barrier for you. That seems like a pretty cool option, but the robot literally has a skill that says just give you barrier, and I'd rather just have straight up barrier generated immediately than getting it over time. Maybe the healing beam is considered a projectile and then use one of the modifiers that make you shoot out multiple projectiles, and then one person in a group uses this robot ability just to keep everybody topped off. Like, it has some cool utility functions to it. But overall, I don't see it as being incredibly impactful or defining of any like really powerful build interactions, again, other than maybe Temerity. Up in the B tier, we're talking about powers that are maybe very strong, maybe not that strong. It's actually kind of this weird middle ground between like A tier and C tier, where it's really going to determine what the mechanic looks like in game, but I could see it having a value. So Firefly is going to deploy an even smaller construct, so that's construct, inception there. But our construct is going to deploy a smaller construct that's going to land on a target and then explode 3 times. The reason why this is generally valuable is because there are a lot of builds that do very good single target damage, but typically are weak against multi-target or density clearing. And just being able to add on another source of density clearing or AoE damage to a kit is typically very strong. On top of that, just being able to have a consistent source of damage to be able to proc effects from the modifying stones, the tuning stones, might have a lot of really good utility. But it again depends on whether or not this is considered a projectile, because tuning stones specifically refer to projectiles and being able to multiply them. So if you could get multiple of these little constructs out onto the battlefield simultaneously, that's just going to go further to multiply its overall effectiveness. So I definitely think, one, it's going to see experimentation. I mean, they all are, but this one in particular, and it has potential to be very good. I just don't see it as auto include anywhere, and it doesn't spark as one of the best application tools for any of the other abilities. Focus Fire is in a similar boat here. The construct is going to channel, again, stopping it from being able to use other skills, which I'm not super a big fan of. That's going to deal fire damage over time to the targets. The reason why this isn't higher or lower is because we don't really know exactly what it's going to look like. Is it going to look like Inferno from Diablo 2, where it's a straight line in front of it, so its range of application isn't that great? Is it instead going to be like a cone effect, so now it's applying a huge amount of damage over time to everything in front of you? Maybe, maybe not. I think it will probably be generally good for, again, density clearing, so just being able to add on another source of AoE damage to a build that typically doesn't have it is just generally valuable. But until we have a better idea of the actual mechanics itself, it's really going to depend on where this would move in a tier list once we ultimately have all of the information. Anything that says channel, I'm always not a big fan of. I wasn't a big fan of decompose. In fact, I only used it when I spam cast it. But generally anything in this video game that says stop moving to do damage is not that great when there are so many better options that say continue to move and continue to do damage. So it just needs to be incredibly powerful to offset the fact that you're kind of stuck doing one thing as opposed to having the agency to be able to do multiple things. Up in the A tier, we're now talking about effects that are just generally very valuable, incredibly strong, and they very well may be S tier for specific builds, but are definitely good for the majority of builds that exist in the game. Lightning Bolt here is the first very clear projectile, which again is going to be able to be modified by the tuning stones, and already is just a very valuable target. It's basically chain lightning. Shoots a lightning bolt at a target that then arcs to other targets, and it's going to deal a portion of the original damage. Anything that says do a huge amount of damage up front and then spread damage out to a bunch of different targets is obviously going to be very good. And the fact that it's actually going to apply its effect to multiple targets seemingly endlessly, maybe it can't hit the exact same target multiple times, but at least bounce out to every target within range. It's going to be very powerful for the tuning stones, since a lot of them say convert your damage and apply an effect. So anything that's able to spread out damage from our Seneschal just becomes that much more valuable for its overall kit. Gyrate absolutely wins S tier for the best named skill at all. Just the concept of my little Seneschal robot boogieing down and gyrating makes me incredibly happy. But on top of that, also seems like it's going to be a very good tool. So it's going to do a melee attack to all damage within surrounding range. So be able to hop into the middle of a pack, deal physical damage to everything around it, seems generally good. Again, being able to hit multiple targets, applying its damage and its effects across multiple targets seems very good. It doesn't necessarily seem like the best overall damage skill that it has available to it, because it has multiple attacks a little bit higher up here in the tier list where it's going to deal damage multiple times. So maybe those ones end up just being better, but I can absolutely see this being as one of the best skills that it has available to it. Again, if only to be able to apply the bonus effects from the tuning stones across the majority of monsters in a combat situation. Where it will obviously fall off is against single targets and bossing, where dealing damage to a bunch of targets around you doesn't really have any added utility if there's only a single target to hit. Bushwhack here at the top of the A tier sounds like it's going to be very good, not only for being able to deal damage to multiple targets, since it will deal damage to each target that it ambushes. The thing here being that ambush is a keyword in the game, most notably on the Waxing Gibbous, which says that you ambush targets, gaining 100% chance to crit against them. So if Bushwhack applies the same ambush mechanic as that effect on the unique item does, then all of a sudden we have a way of generating crit damage on the companions. There are a couple different things that specifically reference crit damage here. And it's just hard to know, like, what are their crit chance? Can we modify their crit chance? Do they gain our stats? We don't really know that information. But if you are able to, like, go invisible and then gain crit chance of 100% to be able to hit targets, on top of that, it can strike the same target multiple times, making it an incredibly good single target damage ability. So if we have automatic crits on a thing that's going to hit a boss like 3 or 4 times in a row, and it uses that fairly quickly, it seems like it's going to be a very good DPS tool overall. And again, hitting multiple times, applying effects multiple times, in general is going to be very high value here for some of the things that we're going to see a little bit later on. And then lastly, here in the S tier, we basically have the things that I believe are just going to be good no matter who uses them and no matter what build you're going for. Either incredibly powerful, a ridiculous amount of utility, an exceptionally high chance of applying damage, you name it, it's probably going to end up here. Starting off with Tempest, I think that this without question is going to be the best attack possible. Again, unless this thing has like a 1 or 2 minute long cooldown, it says that it's going to charge an enemy. It's going to apply a debuff that does lightning damage to the target. And then in addition to that, it's going to deal damage over time every second. The verbiage on this is like very hard to understand. I think it was localized and then localized again. If that enemy were to be killed, Tempest would then spread to another enemy, technically gaining more damage and bonus duration. And then these bonuses are also applied if Tempest is reapplied to the same enemy. So we live in a world where even if it's just on a single target like a boss, your construct could be applying Tempest to the boss multiple times before the duration runs out, meaning that theoretically you can keep adding up additional damage and additional duration in case it ends up getting caught doing something else somewhere. But even just as a tool that says that it's going to continuously spread continuously larger and larger amounts of damage as you fight, means that as long as you can continue to chain enemies into wherever your combat area is or its range of effectiveness, you could theoretically have Tempest following you all the way throughout a dungeon or all the way throughout a boss fight, or just in general helping to finish off the dungeon boss at the end by continuously reapplying it. I think that Tempest just seems like insanely good. There's a universe where it's also considered a projectile. I highly doubt that. I think it's just a debuff which then spreads. But if it's also a projectile, some of these tuning stones are going to make that absolutely bananas as well. But just in general, Tempest definitely seems like the highest potential damage output that we've seen thus far from these skills, just based off of how their descriptions are reading right now. Slash here, very simple. Pummels enemies in front of you, dealing damage. Slash seems like it's going to be the fastest base melee attack that the construct has available to it, and anything that can attack very quickly, again, to be able to apply effects from the tuning stones, seems like it will have a huge amount of versatility and utility to bring to any build, whether it's the ability to apply vulnerable effects or burning effects or shadow damage over time effects or poison effects. There's probably a really high potential ceiling for just having a skill that is triggering all of the time and perpetuating damage at an incredibly fast rate. And that's what Slash reads like to me. Very simple, just kind of a basic attack. You put an increased bonus attack speed tuning stone on this thing, and then you also put the cooldown reduction on it, and they're probably just doing this a mile a minute, continuously reapplying effects and getting the most DPS possible. Out of anything, this seems like it's the best single target skill as well, because if it is as fast as I think it's going to be, it should basically be a continuous source of DPS as opposed to some of the other ones which might have a bit longer of a cooldown. Protect here says that the construct is going to generate barrier for the player that is proportional to your maximum life. Any effect that just says generate barrier is typically very strong in this game, especially for builds that are, most notably on the Necromancer, everybody uses Shielding Storm because Bone Storm has a really good uptime, and then Shielding Storm generates a huge amount of barrier. But any build that's looking to use something other than Shielding Storm as well as Bone Storm just is SOL as far as being able to generate barrier is concerned. So if this barrier has a decent duration, or if the cooldown is not too long, your robot being able to perpetually generate barrier for you helps to activate a huge amount of damage bonuses while barrier is active, lucky hit chance while barrier is active. It opens up the space for not needing to use very specific skills on some builds, or even just in general as better survivability. Yeah, I generate barrier from 2 different sources. Having a third one just means I have much better overall coverage and permanent uptime on that additional defensive stat. And that's just very valuable, kind of regardless of what your build says. So I definitely see a world where Protect is one of the auto-include skills for your bot to have, because barrier just has so many in-game bonuses and just general quality of life that if I have enough barrier, that means I can generally survive things I couldn't previously, where I can't imagine this thing being bad unless the percentage is like 5% of your maximum life once every 20 seconds or something, that's the only way they could really just like absolutely kneecap this thing and have it see no use at all.